Praise the Lord, everyone. Today let us learn the teachings from Psalm 3 in Bible. Here is an in-depth explanation of the spiritual lessons from Psalm 3, with examples to illustrate each point. Psalm 3 is a psalm of lament written by David when he fled from his son Absalom, who had rebelled against him and sought to take the throne. In this psalm, David expresses his trust in God and his confidence that God will deliver him from his enemies. Here are some of the key spiritual lessons that we can learn from Psalm 3. Firstly, the reality of adversity. Psalm 3, 1-2 begins with David acknowledging the reality of his situation. He is surrounded by enemies who seek to harm him, and he feels overwhelmed and helpless. This verse reminds us that adversity is a part of life and that we will all face challenges and difficulties at some point. Let us see an example. The story of Job in the book of Job. Job was a righteous man who faced many trials and tribulations, including the loss of his wealth, his children, and his health. Despite his suffering, he remained faithful to God and ultimately received a double portion of blessings from Him. This illustrates the reality of adversity and the importance of trusting God in the midst of our trials. Secondly, the importance of turning to God in prayer. Psalm 3, 3-4 describes David's prayer to God for help. He acknowledges that God is his shield, his glory, and the one who lifts his head. This verse emphasizes the importance of turning to God in prayer and seeking His help in times of trouble. Let us see an example. The story of Hannah in 1 Samuel 1. Hannah was a woman who longed for a child but was unable to conceive. She turned to God in prayer, pouring out her heart to Him and asking Him for a child. God heard her prayer and granted her request, and she gave birth to a son named Samuel. This illustrates the importance of turning to God in prayer and seeking His help in our time of need. Thirdly, the assurance of God's deliverance. Psalm 3, 5-6 describes David's confidence in God's deliverance. He declares that he will not be afraid of the thousands of people who have set themselves against him because he knows that God is his deliverer. This verse emphasizes the assurance that we can have in God's deliverance and protection. Let us see an example. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel 3. These three men were thrown into a fiery furnace because they refused to worship the king's golden statue. However, God delivered them from the fire, and they emerged unscathed. This illustrates the assurance of God's deliverance and protection for those who remain faithful to Him. Fourthly, the importance of trusting in God. Psalm 3, 7-8 describes David's faith in God's ability to save him. He asks God to arise and save him from his enemies, and he expresses his confidence that God will answer his prayer. This verse emphasizes the importance of trusting in God and believing that He is able to save us. Let us see an example. The story of Abraham in Genesis 22. Abraham was asked by God to sacrifice his son Isaac, but he trusted in God's promise and obeyed His command. God ultimately provided a ram for the sacrifice, and Abraham's faith was rewarded. This illustrates the importance of trusting in God and believing that He is able to fulfill His promises. Fifthly, the promise of God's blessing. Psalm 3:8 ends with David's declaration of God's blessing upon his life. He acknowledges that salvation belongs to the Lord and that His blessing is upon His people. This verse emphasizes the promise of God's blessing for those who trust in Him and follow His ways. Let us see an example. The story of Joseph in Genesis 39-41. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers and faced many trials and tribulations, including imprisonment. However, God was with him and ultimately exalted him to a position of great influence in Egypt. This illustrates the promise of God's blessing for those who remain faithful to him, even in the midst of adversity. Sixthly, the importance of resting in God. Psalm 3:5 describes David lying down and sleeping in the midst of his enemies. This verse emphasizes the importance of resting in God and trusting in his protection, even in the midst of our trials. Let us see an example. The story of Elijah in 1 Kings 19. Elijah was a prophet who faced persecution and fled into the wilderness, where he became discouraged and asked God to take his life. However, God provided for him and gave him rest, encouraging him to continue his ministry. This illustrates the importance of resting in God and trusting in his provision, even in the midst of our struggles. In summary, Psalm 3 teaches us important spiritual lessons about trusting God in the midst of adversity, turning to him in prayer, finding assurance in his deliverance, trusting in his ability to save, experiencing his blessing, and resting in his provision. These lessons are illustrated through various stories in the Bible, which show us both the challenges of facing adversity and the rewards of trusting in God. As we meditate on this psalm and apply its principles to our lives, we can experience the peace and protection that comes from trusting in God. May God bless you.